In this episode, I'm excited to have a chat with a fellow PhD in depth psychology and an alum of Pacifica Graduate Institute. We're going to talk about two of my favorite topics combined, the feminine and film. First, though, if you enjoy my interviews and free content, it would be great if you could take a moment to like, subscribe, and share. Also, consider becoming a $5 monthly supporter of Dose of Depth podcast to help me cover the costs of production, which I do all by myself. I'll include the link in the description box. So, Jen Degnan Smith has a PhD in Jungian and Archetypal Psychology, an MA in Applied Psychology, and a BA in Economics. Her career spans the US and Europe, focusing on where psychology and business intersect and teaching organizational behavior to MBA and undergraduate students. She's currently co-teaching a PhD course on the psychological and cultural impacts of technology at Pacifica Graduate Institute. Jen is dedicated to healing and empowering the feminine principle within individuals and cultures. She writes, consults, speaks, and teaches about how to find a new feminine through myth, images, dreams, synchronicities, and place. And Jen works with people to find their soul's calling, as connecting to soul is a key part of empowering the feminine. So let's get started. Welcome, Jen.
Thank you, Deborah. It's nice to see you.
You too. So how are you doing and what's happening in your life? And of course, we have to hear if there's a juicy story behind how you found yourself at Pacifica, because for me, the calling came through a synchronicity that was so odd and it was so irrational. And literally after living half my life in a very business plan oriented way, it was like, oh, I just know this is going to save my soul. I don't know why. And I had to do it. And it was the beginning of my midlife unraveling. So I don't know what kind of story you have.
Oh, well, not dissimilar. I think when you just said, it saved my soul, I think I give credit to Pacifica for that as well. So, my story of finding myself at Pacifica, I think like a lot of people, it was on my bucket list for many years. And I found myself in my mid-40s and kind of hitting a midlife crisis, which I think is not an unfamiliar story. And the story is that my son and my husband were both doing very well. And my husband's career was going very well, and my son had just gotten accepted to kind of his dream colleges, which of course I was thrilled about both of those things. But at that moment, I also had this little voice inside of me that said, "What about me?" And which I know sounds terrible, and I don't mean to be. I don't know. It sounds a little terrible, and it was partly ego-driven, no doubt. But I think it was also my soul. It was definitely my soul. It wasn't. I don't think it. I know it. And it was just saying to me, I've been in the business world for many years. I taught at business schools, again, a world I have enjoyed. But there was that part of my soul that was not being fed, really kind of looking deeply at the psychological and looking at the meaning of life. And so I actually found myself at the Cycladic Museum in Athens, Greece, writing my application, surrounded by, these ancient feminine figures. And they had a special exhibit of Demeter and Persephone and of their myth while I was writing my application. And it all just felt like it was, meant to be. So that's my story. I don't know how that resonates with you.
Oh, definitely. Oh my gosh. Like, whoa. Well, and it's so Hermes-ish too. You know what I mean? Like you had to go all the way to Greece to like get it done, pull the trigger, right?
Very true. Very true. It was like I needed the energy or I needed whatever the spirit of Greece was to kind of get me there. Yeah.
Well, and also because, and I think for women in midlife unraveling, this question of like, you said, oh, I know that sounds bad, like to go after what, right? Like women especially. So part of that unraveling is understanding that what is ego, what's not ego, and, what does it mean to listen to soul, So
Exactly.
I love it. I love the story. Thanks for sharing. So let's dive right into the feminine,
Okay,
one of my
great.
favorite topics, because
Good.
it's everywhere, you know? How can't you go about life these days and either see where it's missing or where it's adding a new contribution? So my listeners and viewers are used to me talking about the feminine, masculine, not as biology and gender. So they're sort of used to that. And I don't know who it was that described it more as like styles of consciousness, styles of movements, just different ways we can experience our experience. So they're also used to hearing me say that, we all carry a patriarchal wound, not
Yes.
just women. Women's patriarchal wound is different. It's more oppression related, but men's patriarchal wound is no less wounding, having your whole sense of masculine identity tied to being above someone else and having to say, well, you're not masculine enough, is like, that's like feels really heavy. So and then also I just had a chat with a colleague from my hometown who was a chief judge, and she's the new director of a Center for Restorative Justice, Marquette Law School. And our conversation really made it clear that restorative justice is the feminine coming in to sort of balance out the criminal justice system that has relied, almost solely on punishment, but isn't really working at the same time, right? So it was really so I hope my listeners and viewers are getting used to seeing how, when you bring in this other, it's not an either or, right? It's a more like being fluid and a little bit about, I actually like fluid more than balancing. So
Mm.
so you're also interested in how the denigration of the feminine has wounded, on a bigger picture, like cultures, places, of course, nature and the planet. And there are I tell people there's so many, offshoots of depth psychology. It's huge. It's this big, right? So eco psychology is something I got a little bit of a taste of in Pacifica, and not really terror psychology. And then, so maybe you could introduce us to these two different areas or fields or components of depth psychology. And then maybe it would be good to work in your research topic a little bit, because I also love the idea of the feminine in economics.
Okay,
So just
great.
to touch
Great.
on, so wherever you want to go with
Oh,
that,
okay.
that'll be new.
Thanks.
That'll be brand new stuff for my listeners and viewers.
Oh, that's great. Well, and just to say that really, I concur with your perspective on the masculine and feminine. And I think the more that we look at it that way, the better chances are at anything from kind of achieving gender equality to kind of dealing with some of the major issues that we have going on in our world. So I think it's really important to kind of separate the principles or the essences from the genders. So fantastic. And in terms of eco-psychology and terror psychology, Craig Chalquist is the one who sort of came up with terror psychology. And I highly recommend his work to your listeners. I mean, he's got tons of, videos and books, and so just something to keep in mind. And he describes, it's interesting, one way of looking at terror psychology is that it is kind of the baby of eco-psychology as the mother and depth psychology as the father. And he goes into quite a lot of differences between eco-psychology and terror psychology, which actually I would direct your listeners to. So I'll talk a little bit more about terror psychology, if that's okay. And actually it was part of the research approach that I used in my dissertation. But actually, I would almost say terror psychology found me before I found it. And so just a bit of background, and I can weave in my dissertation topic through this as well, is I spent about 8 years going back and forth to Greece. And we're based in the States, but I was going over there. My husband's work took us there quite extensively. And so when I started there, I did a lot of the touristy things that everybody does. Fantastic. Went to the Acropolis and all the rest of it. And when I ran out of kind of things to look at, which is hard to believe, I actually just started walking the streets. Like I just started walking around Athens, where we spent a lot of time. And as I started to do that, I have to say the city sort of came to life for me at that point. I'd have strange synchronicities that would happen as I was walking along, or I would start to notice the images. I know some of your previous guests have talked about kind of the power of images. There's a lot of street art, especially I was there during the Greek economic crisis. So there was all this phenomenal street art that was happening, or these museum exhibits that I would just sort of stumble across. And what I realized, or what it seemed like to me, is that Greece, or Athens particularly, was trying to speak to me. Like it was trying to tell me about its woes, because of course they were in the midst of their crisis. I was also in the midst of my crisis. And in some ways, it was as if it was trying to tell me about me as well as about it. And so, I had this strange situation where I was riding on a tram, and the tram suddenly stopped, and everybody got out of, they announced something in Greek, which I didn't speak. And everybody left, and I finally figured out I better go. And it turns out later, I found out later that the pavement ahead of us on the track had started to disintegrate. And what had happened is the cement, back in the 50s and 60s, a lot of Athens was cemented over, including a lot of the sacred rivers that we read about. And so it was like the city was starting to say, I've had enough of this cement over my sacred places, a bit like I was also experiencing, of like it was, time for me to stop covering up these parts of myself that I have been, kind of heal the wounds, my feminine wounds. And at the same time, I think Greece was trying to go back and heal a lot of its wounds because it's dealt with a lot in its lifetime. And so, it's like, it, kind of felt a little like, am I going crazy? That all of, I feel like I'm almost in this mystical world. And then I stumbled across Craig's work in parapsychology, which is very much about believing and accepting that the world around us is ensouled, that we really bring back the soul of the world, and that if we speak to it, if it listens, or it speaks to us, and we can speak to it if we choose to listen. And actually what's going on in the environment often reflects what's happening in our own psyches, and vice versa, so that we're really deeply connected. And so the part of parapsychology that really refers to is something called ecotransference, which is where the unhealed wounds of the places that we live and our own unhealed wounds kind of overlap and resonate. So what I found through my experiences within Greece, and also my experiences with the dissertation, is really working on healing my own inner feminine, and Greece, and culturally looking at healing the feminine in Greece, and particularly looking at healing the feminine in economics, which really economics doesn't take the feminine into account at all.
Right.
So I hope does that make sense? Okay.
Well, I love it because you really helped us understand through story.
Yeah.
And that is how we can connect with it. So I feel that, I feel like if people just sat still for a moment, they could probably recall an instance in their own lives where they oddly allowed like a tree to communicate to them.
Yes.
Right? Like right now, this fall weather is so beautiful, and I take morning walks, and I really don't walk many feet before something just calls to me. And it'll be like one blooming flower on this big stalk. And I'm like, are you talking to me? Like literally, I feel like it has drawn me closer to it. And then I don't know, maybe I get a new idea. I don't know what happens after that. But yeah. And you're right. It's like, there's that saying that our outer world, our experience of the outer world, is a reflection of our inner world, right? And at the same time, the outer world impacts our inner world. So it's not one direction. And now it's just a mess.
Yeah.
Now it's chaos. Like even this notion of, well, you can manifest, whatever. It's like, no, you really can't get away from sort of the wounds of the world unless you're someplace beautiful and detached, detached from all the activities. So, I really appreciate that. And I am going to, when we're done, get some more specific information on Craig so I can add those links to so can I just quickly ask, because I'm so interested about the economics thing, like what was one of your conclusions or observations or insights like at the end of your dissertation, your research that had to do with the feminine and economics in Greece?
Well, back to, back to the idea of the synchronicity in terror psychology. I was writing my final chapter. Actually, it was in San Diego. We moved here, and it was just before COVID hit. And I was thinking about using the Medusa myth
Mm.
as it's sort of in the conclusion. And I remember thinking, is this the right myth, or is this what I should be doing? And I went to get a new pair of running shoes, and the gentleman who was fitting me with them, he had a tattoo on his arm, and I said, you know, is that? And it looked like it was sort of Medusa's head, and sure enough, it was Perseus holding up Medusa's head. And so I thought, okay, again, this is sort of how I know this is how the dissertation sort of wrote itself. Um, and so for me, a lot of it is Medusa. There is that element of Medusa was um, attacked by Poseidon. And so she has a patriarchal wound. And of course, she was, stuck in the underground and, in the underworld, and, was holding on to these, this anger and this rage, which she rightly, needed to do to hold on to. And it's that element of really, how do we transform the patriarchal wound, which was a big part of a big part of the findings for me in economics. I mean, the other thing I found with Greece particularly is it as I mentioned earlier, is it did endure a lot of wounding. So a lot during World War II, the Ottoman rule. And so, we look at the cultural complexes, which Thomas Singer talks about, is where are the unhealed wounds. And so a lot of it is the feminine. A lot of the economics everywhere, this is not just Greece, is run by that which is very rational, from the intellect, worried about growth, a lot of the Titanic comes in there too, which really we're missing the feminine gods. We're missing the connection to nature, looking at, business, if we're looking at businesses, it's all about profits, but it's not about looking at how they're impacting the community, how they're impacting nature. Are they really looking at diversity from a holistic perspective rather than just kind of looking at quotas? It's all of those things.
Or like, well, what is the purpose of an economy? I always just want to ask that basic question because everybody thinks they know. And this is a funny example to share, and this is probably like 15 years ago. And my former husband and I were just somewhere out fun, having a beer, whatever it was. And we started talking about, at the time it was like Prozac was like this over prescribed thing going on. Maybe that's, by now almost everybody's on something, right? Which is not a good thing, right? That's the feminine missing. But anyway, so he's like, well, and I was concerned about, the over prescribing of this. And my former husband says, well, it's good for the economy. And in that moment, I was like, but what is the economy for? Like, is it just about sell whatever you can, and as long as it makes money, it's good for the economy? So that's just a little example of how, of how very easily a depth psychology perspective on a very basic level can change the questions that you ask and the questions that you're not asking. And you just accept the way that things are without saying, oh, but what was the purpose? It's like when I interviewed Elizabeth Martin, a fellow PhD from Pacifica, and she looked at the Citizens United decision through a depth psychology lens. And I learned about that the root of the corporation had nothing to do with profit. It had to do with more efficiently meeting the needs of growing populations. So it had nothing to do with profit. So, we think things have always been this way. So anyway, well, thanks for doing a little economics there. So I really loved your article, The Shape of Water. I haven't seen the movie. So many people have said you have to see this movie, and I know it's fantastic. And I like how you talk about it as a living fairy tale that prompts reconciliation between these two myths. And I want you to talk about that. So the myth of progress, and which people are starting to understand. I mean, there have been voices for 50 years saying this is not sustainable, this is not sustainable, but this myth of progress. And then this other myth, the newer myth of the fall. And then you talk about how the main character's relationship with this mysterious sea creature is this, I think I'm calling it the transcendent third, but this relationship is meant to be in the space between these two opposing, what seems to be an opposition. And so I just want you to talk about that. And then also, start by maybe telling my viewers and listeners, about the role of fairy tales in sort of a depth psychology perspective. And then, yeah, tell me. I mean, I loved reading that article.
Oh, good. Well, the movie's just fantastic. I mean, Del Toro, is really has done a phenomenal job. So, and I think, in terms of fairy tales, it's Marie-Louise von Franz who said that really they give us the most access to really what's going on in the psyche. There's no cultural overlays. And of course, with them, with fairy tales, it's often the feminine that's being rescued, right? Or that's being, taken care of and being brought back into power. So the fairy tale piece, I think, is really an important. It was an important choice of his, I think, to use for that. So, but with the two approaches that we have, Strickland, who was the part of the military and wanted the sea creature, called him the asset, because they really wanted to learn its secrets in order to win the space race. And, they tried to do that through violence, right? Treated the creature very poorly, did it through violence, and get to the point where they were going to sort of kill it and dissect it to figure out what they could learn about it, which is a lot of kind of how our world is now with nature, right? We exploit it for our own needs, thinking very little about the long-term effects on the environment. Of course, we are dependent on the environment, so we're, harming ourselves in that process. And then, you have Eliza, who comes in and looks at this creature and just looks at him with curiosity, trying to understand him. And she, of course, represents the feminine. She's, had a wound as a child. She was an orphan, had a wound as a child, and lost her voice, and which is very symbolic of the feminine in our culture, is not really having a voice or a presence. And she worked on the custodial staff, and all of the men were the scientists in the military. So, seeing a lot of the differences between that. And the way that Eliza approached it is really sort of a parapsychological perspective, is believing that it is an ensouled life, that it has an intelligence of its own, and that really by working together we can learn more. So but the one thing about Eliza's perspective, which comes in later on in the story, is she rescues the creature. Sorry, there's some plot spoilers in here for you, but so she rescues the creature, but she also is reliant on a scientist to save the creature, because he needs salt in his water and he needs certain things to happen. And so, although the scientist that helps her actually is a spy for Russia, but he also refuses to kill the creature, because he, through Eliza's eyes, started to see really that this creature was godlike, had this sort of presence about it. And so, for me, that is a little bit of this need to work with science, but with science that isn't just looking at objectifying nature around us, but looking to appreciate the value of nature. And that shows up in biomimicry, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with biomimicry or not.
A little bit. Yeah.
And I know some eco-psychologists look at biomimicry. I know where I used to live in Montana, there's a big biomimicry institute, but it's very much around, working with nature, honoring nature, looking longer term at, our impact on the environment. So it's really, Eliza gives us this new way of looking at nature, working with nature through the story. And even at the very end, Strickland, recognizes that the asset is actually a god, and he sort of says that is, you really are a god. So his perspective changes, although it changes while he's dying. So, hopefully we get there before that, but really recognizing. And, the God image, I think, is really an important piece of all of this. I don't, know whether, you've talked about that much with your listeners before, but that element of, and Del Toro brings that very much into the film, is that, the belief that we're made in the image of God, that man is made in the image of God, immediately sort of puts us on the pedestal above all the other creatures. And so, trying to recognize that they are also, divine is an important part of changing our perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's amazing, like how long the collective and psyche ensouled world has been trying to like get us to try to understand this. I don't know why this is coming up for me, but during my unraveling, I was at some random garage sale and pulled out this book. And it's the author, it's a woman author. It was written and published in like 1880 something. And it really was about the tension, even that many years ago, between science and spirituality,
Mm.
science and religion. And it did a beautiful job of like bringing them together. And such an amazing book, because for some reason we're stuck in this duality, right? Like it's always got to be one or the other. And I think what you're getting across in this film is that there is a merging, right? So the scientist is needed, but the scientist is different. And also, I appreciate there's so many things
Uh,
actually that I want to say, but because talking about science and reason and logic, Susan Rowland, one of our professors, I'm sure she was yours too.
Yep.
She now is publishing this series of novels. So she went from all those amazing academic books, and now she's writing these stories about this trio of women detectives. And one of them is a survivor of sex trafficking. And so she's finding a way to look at, marginalized groups as the heroes and heroines that we need, because they have a different kind of a wounding, a different kind of perspective. But in her first book, what was so fascinating is she got at this, and you get at this, where being reasonable and logical right now isn't really adequate to get people's attention about what we're living through, the devastation of our own like species right now. And it's fascinating. And for people who can see it, and they're frustrated. And so in her book, part of the backdrop is is the devastating consequences of climate change we're already experiencing, but is this character, this woman scientist, who literally kind of goes nuts, and she finds herself in a cult. And you could say, well, it's kind of a good cult because they revive this old myth about the importance of water, but they literally become an extremist like organization that like murders people, but yet they're the good guys, right? Like they're going crazy. So like I feel that in what you're talking about. And then also images and film. So film has been one way the unconscious really speaks to me, like whoa, like is in my face all the time, where I have to go see movies 8 times and then I get these insights about what's going on in the collective and et cetera. So just for my listeners and viewers, I love, I think it's Luke Hockley, The Third Image.
Yeah.
And, I just think about it as when I'm in the movie theater, that there's this space. It's a physical space, but it's a psychological space between the images on the film and me, and how things get stirred up. And we might not even know they're stirred up because it's unconscious, but sometimes we can sense it. And if we're aware, there's the space, the transcendent third space, where something comes up out of the unconscious that could be personal, or it could be something that you then see in the collective once you've sort of become more aware of your own personal complex. So I love that. And when I was reading your article, one of the movies that I remembered was The Abyss. 1989. So up until then, when you talked about like In the Shape of Water, the scientists like dissecting, wanting to dissect, every alien movie up until then, well, they still are mostly when we find an alien, another life form, what do? We dissect it, right? And we are fearful of it, the unknown, of course. And in The Abyss, the alien took the shape of water. So I don't know if you saw that movie.
I did not,
you
or
might
not for
have
many
to.
years that I remember. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you might look at it a different way now. And this was 1989. So it has like the same sort of message as The Shape of Water, but it was a blockbuster film. It was like and I think there's so much more in just regular like blockbuster films than people realize, right? Like people want to, because there's a reason there's a blockbuster, other than it might be a formula. Sometimes it's a blockbuster because there's something different, that wasn't expected, and how people are experiencing it. But anyway, and then the mirroring. So the water, which everybody was afraid of, or the alien took the shape of water and would go through the ship. And like at a certain point, all the characters were like, and the water would mirror back their shape of their face.
Wow.
And then some of the characters would like stick their face. So it was this beautiful, like mirroring thing going on. And of course they still tried to kill it, but they weren't successful. And then the alien actually saved them. So for me, I was like, whoa, this is a different kind of alien movie. The alien's good, man.
Yeah.
And we learn, and the alien saves our life. So it reminded me of that. And then another movie having to do with water is Aquaman. Again, like a superhero film. Those are the ones that speak to me. And when that movie came out, maybe it was 2018, I had just read Robin Robertson's book, Beginner's Guide to Revelation. It's a depth psychology interpretation of the biblical book of Revelation. And so it's like, I was just like, oh my God, I see this going on in the world. It's not about a literal, right?
Yeah.
Literal end of the world. It's about like our spiritual awakening. And when I went to see Aquaman, I was like, oh my God, this is his book. Did they consult with him when they made this movie? Everything from the beast, from the seven, worlds, so in the end, it was about reconciling the right to exist, the underworld, and the out of water world. So those are some of the things that came up to me that I hope our conversation just prompts people to think about. It really is, everything's trying to communicate with us in really sneaky ways. And if we just sort of like wonder and be curious about it, we can hear some messages. So anyway, I don't know. I feel like I just talked a bunch. So
I was just thinking that if at the beginning of The Shape of Water, the narrator says, this is a story about the Princess Eliza and the monster who almost destroyed it all. And so you assume that the monster is a sea creature, but of course it's not. It's Strickland. And so, it is this, even that sort of sets your psyche up for a certain sort of way for the thing to unravel. And then it's a surprise because the monster isn't who we thought it was. So again, that whole change of perspective of just those one lines can make a big difference, or the one image within a film can make a big difference, can just be very powerful.
Even just what you said, the monster isn't who we think it is.
It's exactly.
Right? Like, where's our inner monster? Right?
Exactly.
Like, yes. So let's see. Tell us more about, because the first thing you said is you're all about reimagining the feminine in the individual and collective. So I described it as you must have a love affair with this part of it. And, just what does it mean to you? And what does it look like? What could it look like? Are you seeing it budding someplace and you're like, ooh, there, it's happening there. And also, what do you think is the unconscious agenda underneath your passion for this as well?
Oh, very good question. Oh, that's a lot of questions. I'll see what I can do.
You just take whatever one you want. You don't even have to remember them.
Fantastic. Well, I think for me, the imagining is, of course, I'm thinking about it from a James Hillman perspective. That, you talked a lot about the wounding of the feminine, and really, James Hillman talks about the role of imagination in healing. And so for me, I think a big part of kind of healing, because I sort of started playing with, am I healing the feminine, empowering the feminine? I think it's all of those things, but really that feels like it's embodied in imagining, the reimagining. And partly because, the way that Western culture, patriarchal culture, imagines the feminine is in a very narrow, limited way, which, as Marion Woodman and many other depth psychology scholars talks about is, we're sort of, women are confined to certain roles, we're not allowed anger, and I know I'm talking now gender versus principle, but there's an element of women have had to carry the feminine. And that's also part of the patriarchal imagining of the feminine, is that women carry it, right? So reimagining the feminine would include everyone, however they gender identify, to actually hold the elements of the feminine. And part of that goes back to, back to my time in ancient Greece, or I wish I was back in ancient Greece, but my time in Greece, studying the ancient myth, is that, they had a broader view of what the feminine was. And we see that in the different goddesses, that whether it was Aphrodite, Athena, Artemis, Persephone, and Demeter, was, how can we bring some of those goddess energies back into today's world. So, the one thing I realized through the dissertation, through my time at Pacifica, was really how much of a patriarchal wounding I had and how damaged my feminine was. And really, and as they talk about, not only is our feminine damaged, but so is the masculine. Like we don't necessarily carry this sort of healthy masculine. And my findings in the dissertation is that economics has done the same thing. We aren't embracing, as I said before, a lot of elements of the feminine. And so and again, back to the parapsychological, the inner versus not inner versus outer, but the inner and outer, both and, is that we need to heal the inner feminine to come back into our power. And we also need to heal the feminine in the culture, so one doesn't undermine the other, and that both support each other. So, I mean, in a very practical way, how do we do that? I've run over the years workshops with people around their careers and vocation, which to me is very much around touching the feminine, because it's very much about being connected to soul. Is what does soul want me to do in this world? Yeah. And I think looking at organizations, because I used to do a lot of organizational consulting, and looking at the feminine is where is the feminine in the culture? So where are we really truly embracing diversity? Where are we, looking at embracing people's emotions? The somatic, like the body, the embodied experience. Where are we honoring people's intuition? Where are we going with the flow instead of constantly worried about goals and achievement and, as I talked about before, profits and growth? And so for me, that reimagining the feminine is looking at these other ways of being feminine and imagining them for ourselves, because the way that I'm feminine is not going to be how you're feminine, how everybody else embraces the feminine, and also looking at that in the outer culture. So
yeah, I mean, it's just so you gave a very feminine answer. It's meandering, right? It's not black or white. There's no clarity. Many things came up for me. One of them being a few years ago, back in my consulting days, I enjoyed doing annual strategic planning with this, historic nonprofit organization that was very interested in tamping down the exploitive nature of real estate development in the community, right? So, and I learned so much, but their approach was really feminine. So instead of being combative with real estate developers, they were conversational with them. And the way that they described, how to add the feminine perspective to developing a community in a way. And I know there's a lot of things going on in the country where when they're being more intentional about what do we want in a neighborhood, what do we want in a community, multi-use and, diverse use, and, can people walk to work and walk to the corner grocery? Like, how do we maximize the interaction and engagement between people, things like that. And that was way before I was even studying depth psychology, but I was like, now that I think about it, that was one way. And it was hard to get real estate developers to go, to not look at it as, oh, well, I'm going to lose potential revenue by not being able to build a 30-floor building, right? And so it did take a very collaborative way, but they were successful. That's what was so interesting to me.
Great news. Yeah.
It was that you would think you'd have to kind of fight fire with fire, and they didn't, which is interesting. And then the other thing that came up to me is Artemis is my favorite. I wrote about her in because Artemis speaks to me, because I've always been an activist, very active feminist in my 20s, and loved Thelma and Louise choosing death over, oppression, and she's also misunderstood. Even Bolin, who writes about her, she actually disses her and says that she's, because of her overly competitive nature, that's why her lover died. And I'm like, what? You're
Hmm.
blaming her for that? Anyway, it's interesting because for me, Artemis almost represents the fluidity of the masculine and the feminine. She's very much feminine, and she's the one who's like, looks out for young girls and helps women in labor. But she's also masculine in that she hunts. And, and when the hunter comes and sees her naked body without her permission, she sends his own dogs after him. So she has like this fluidity, and that I really enjoy. And she didn't get married, but she was in love, and her lover was her friend. So even that whole, topic, one of my favorite topics to explore with my clients is the dismantling of all the conventions about relationship and sexuality. And so another way that I think the feminine is coming in is understanding the deeper meaning of sexual energy.
Yeah.
It's not like wham bam, thank you, ma'am. Like that's one literal playing out of sexual energy. It's creative energy, it's life energy, right? And so as
Yeah.
people start to, understand that polyamory isn't about like having a lot of sex partners, but it's about many loves and being able to engage deeply with more than one person, not all, sometimes intellectually. So I do see it a lot. And I love describing the feminine as meandering.
Yeah.
And which that was hard for me. So coming of age in the 80s, maybe you did too, was very much we're overly developed in our masculine sensibility, right?
Yes.
Where we know how to set goals, we know all of that. And so, yeah, so I had a wounded feminine. And I also say that we don't really know what the natural masculine is.
Mm.
It's been defined for so long and seen through, even when you look back, what lens are you looking through to
Yeah.
understand what the natural masculine is? We don't
Yes.
know. It's all kind
Yeah.
of up for grabs. Um, so yeah, this is great. So what else let's see, I'm on a mission to grow a movement of self-reflecting humans. And I do that through my depth psychology coaching and interviews and blog posts and books and things like that. So I wonder if, I think we've been kind of specific, but I wonder how you think that my listeners and viewers might take this conversation. And I wonder if there's something specific that you can offer about taking this and how they can, I don't know, take it into their lives, integrate it, or like notice things differently, whether it's in their work life or I don't know. Just what are your thoughts on like
Yeah.
how, I don't know.
Well, I think, you touched on some of it. I think the kind of watching film, looking or story, TV or whatever it happens to be, is a great way of doing that. I think there's also the element of, like we talked about, listening to the world around us. So paying
Mm,
attention, like you said, whether it's to the flower or to the synchronicity, or to the image that appears. Um, you know, I think for me, we talk about kind of purpose in life, and usually, and often that's tied to our wounding, right? Is that for me, it is really about helping people to really reconnect to that feminine side and really honor it and heal it. And again, in the environment, I mean, part of it can be small things. So like I've suggested to people when they have a meeting, is have there been moments of synchronicity that they should recognize,
mm,
rather than just go straight into like the planning element of what has to be done today
mm,
or tomorrow.
mhm.
I think also kind of being able to acknowledge our emotions at work, because they inform. I mean, you know they're not to be ignored. They're informational. So like recognizing emotions when we're working with other people. I think some of those small things, like I was talking to somebody yesterday actually, that I think the idea of just making, like, empowering the feminine in the culture is needs to happen at a grassroots level. That starts with you, that starts with
Yeah.
me, that starts with the listeners. I'd love to say, oh, we can go into work with senior management and change everything. I don't think that usually doesn't work. I don't want to, throw that potential completely away. But I think it's all about, how am I serving the feminine today? And how are we
Mm,
as a group serving the feminine? How are we as an organization serving the feminine? And, you talked about the real estate example. And I think I may have mentioned I'm co-teaching with Glenn Slater at Pacifica, the class about technology. And really it's looking at what is it, the products that we're building or the technologies that we're building, to what extent are they serving the feminine as well within the individuals or within the community. So for me, a lot of it is just the very like day-to-day stuff, I think, can make a big difference.
Oh, well, you're absolutely right. I mean, I don't know if there's even an example of how a major paradigm shift has occurred from the top down. It always
Yeah.
is something bubbling up and it's happening right now with, for example, the UAW strike that, that everyone said it's impossible to get this after these decades of exploitation. And the thing is, here's the thing about the one-sided masculine, not the healthy masculine, but you could call it toxic masculine, is that once you have power, you literally can't give it back unless it's taken. Unless you're super, super aware. For the most part, there is this thing that's, the meaning of the saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely, is because you get swept up in it. Hubris isn't something you choose. There's like a sweeping up in it, either as an individual or collectively. And so, I used to many years ago, there was a book that came out, Women, Negotiation and the Gender Divide. And it was all about research on, at the time, companies were trying to do better, where if it was a major law firm, they would make the same offer, let's say, to a new lawyer, whether it was a man or a woman. But what happened in every case? A man asked for more.
Yep.
Women were just like, thank you very much. I'm so happy to have a job.
Yeah.
And that ended up like losing them $1 million over their career. So, so you could say, well, let's wait for government to like pass these laws to force, but at the same time, like the feminine or women or the feminine in men has to really take back its power. And that's what's happening sort of at a grassroots level right now.
Yeah.
So I love that you said that.
Thinking about Glenn Slater's work, on the Titanic. I don't know if you have his work, but he very much brings up the point that, in ancient times, the Titanic, the Titans were only sunk back into the oceans by the other gods and goddesses, by the Olympic gods and goddesses. So that's how we contain the Titanic. That is in our organizations, in economics, in all of those things, is by bringing back bringing back Artemis, bringing back Aphrodite, like bringing back these other more soulful elements into our culture, which I think we can do as individuals, or like I said, within companies or groups or whatever. So that's how we deal with the Titanic.
Well, right.
Yeah.
Right. And by soulful and gods and goddesses, meaning something to which you feel responsible for that transcends you.
Yes.
So God, right? So people who are religious or spiritual know that there's something in them that's bigger than everything they know about themselves and is a bridge to something that transcends them. And it's that sort of reverence for what transcends us that will make us have guardrails to protect us from ourselves. Right.
Exactly.
But
yes.
and that's what we need. So, and emotions, my work with my clients and especially in the workplace is that I say that emotions are one way our unconscious is speaking to us.
Yes. Oh,
right.
Absolutely.
So
absolutely.
anger. Okay. And anger is hard for people. Right. So what does anger want from you?
Yeah.
Not to project it, but what does anger want? And maybe you are living in an unjust situation. So what is anger asking of you? What is frustration? What is your authority complex? Like all of that. And so, it doesn't necessarily mean express those emotions, but it does mean to be curious about what they want from you. And as just an individual, they may want you to show up differently. And then that ends up creating a tipping point. So it always happens. Oh, I know we hate we have to do it as individuals, but that's the only way it happens. So.
Yeah. And then we find our people to do it with, I think, too.
Yes.
I do think that anger is often a sign that someone once said it to me, that a line's been crossed. And that has helped me to really accept anger is like, okay, this means that something's happened, that something needs to be dealt with, and it's
Yes.
calling on me to do so.
And there is righteous anger. And sometimes the
Yes.
anger is ancestral anger and it's collective anger. And it's like,
Yes.
this never even happened to me. Why do I feel so angry when I hear people? And so then there's that whole part of, reconciling with or relating to your complexes too at a deeper level.
Exactly.
So,
Yep.
so this is great. Is there anything else that you want to add or share? And, what's next for you? I know you're trying to figure out some new things. And do
Yeah.
you want people to follow you? And do you, all that stuff?
That's great. No, thanks. And, it was just rich. I mean, I feel like there's 1,000 different ways we could have gone and, could still go. So, no, I'd look forward to maybe talking again in the future. I mean, I think this is just an ongoing, we're evolving with it, I think. And I'm on Instagram. That's where I put most of my stuff, LinkedIn. And partly I like Instagram because of the images, because I think of course, images speak so much. So that's where I go. I'm starting to roll out a new course on empowering the feminine within and without. So within ourselves and sort of in the greater community. I was going to say, I have a book here. This is Craig just edited a book I've got a chapter in. So that's his part of his work. And a lot of us have contributed. So if you want to, our stories about how parapsychology kind of has shown up for us. So that might be very much of interest, but I think that's about it. And, really just, thank you for having me on your podcast, and thank you for all of the other discussions. I see that you're working hard to, bring soul back into the world and make a lot of changes. So
in my own way, I'm like, I tell people I'm a regular peeps person. So like, I want to, our particular program was not clinical. It really was about like, how can me, the way I am, what I do for a living, how can I incorporate, these depth psychology and archetypal psychology ideas and bring them into the world. And I've always been like that, I'm that activist. So I'm at that level, and I like to bring it. I like to focus there. So,
well, I think you mentioned you're doing a memoir as well. Is that because I've done the same thing and again, how I've been healing my inner feminine. So
yeah, mine is juicy. I'm almost done. Oh yeah, because my dissertation explored women's experience of reconciling sexuality and spirituality through individuation. And so right after I submitted my final draft, I outcame 50,000 words of the juicy stuff that wasn't needed or appropriate in an academic paper, right? So this is, it's going to be really interesting. So I love the whole sex and God topic. So that's
juicy's
my
good. We need juicy, right? I mean, that's great.
It's vulnerable. And so, there are a lot of people who have been living through me vicariously already. So I think they'll really like it. So I appreciate your time. And whenever you want to come back on, I've got my colleague and my former Jungian analyst, Vlado Solak, who wrote Dark Religion. He's been on 3 times. So he comes every few months and we do something different. So if you ever are like, ooh, I really want to talk about this, or talk about what's in your course or whatever, just reach out, because I love having people back on. Jolie Hamilton, I've had her on twice. So I like to have people come back and continue the conversation.
That's great.
Well, so thank you so much. I hope you all enjoyed my conversation with Jen Degnan Smith. Until next time.
Thank you.